The audio starts mid-sentence. No warning, no context, just a voice calm, cold, and absolutely certain of itself, giving orders to someone named Wao, not pleading, not bargaining, commanding, and underneath those words, one phrase that explains everything. Asterisk, they sold us. That voice belonged to Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, the man the world knew as El Mencho, and those were the last words he ever recorded. On February 22nd, 2026, one of the most wanted men alive was killed in the mountains of Jalisco, Mexico. The United States had $15 million on his head. Mexico had 30 million pesos posted for anyone who could hand him over. Entire intelligence agencies on both sides of the border had spent years trying to find him, and then, in a matter of minutes, it was over, with an audio clip circulating online that made it impossible to look away. But here's what people weren't ready for. It wasn't the death that shocked them. It was what he said while dying. The clip surfaced on X, formerly Twitter, within hours of the military operation concluding. Analysts, journalists, and ordinary people across 2 countries listened to it on loop, trying to process what they were hearing. El Mencho, cornered, surrounded by special forces, helicopters overhead, and soldiers closing through the trees. And he wasn't asking for mercy. He was issuing threats. He was still running his organization. Right up until the moment his body gave out, he operated like a man who believed the universe owed him obedience. That tells you more about who El Mencho was than any biography ever could. But to understand why those final words carried so much weight, you need to understand the operation that produced them and how it nearly didn't happen at all. Mexican Defense Secretary Ricardo Trevilla confirmed that military intelligence had been shadowing El Mencho's network for months before February 22nd, not surveilling him directly. That was nearly impossible, given the security architecture he had built around himself, but watching the people closest to him, his associates, his movements, his habits, and one habit, above all others, created the opening the military needed. Investigators identified a trusted associate connected to one of El Mencho's romantic partners. That associate personally escorted the woman to a remote cabin on the outskirts of Tapalpa, Jalisco, on February 20th. She spent time there with El Mencho, and then, on February 21st, she left. El Mencho stayed behind. That was the moment the clock started. By early February 22nd, the operation was in motion. 3 separate forces converged simultaneously, ground troops moving through the terrain on foot, an air mobile unit deploying 6 helicopters, a Mexican Air Force Texan aircraft providing support from above. It was not a raid, it was a siege. When the first units reached the cabin and announced their presence, El Mencho's security detail opened fire immediately because, of course, they did. This was CJNG. These men had rocket launchers. 8 of his guards were killed in the initial exchange. When the dust settled on that first engagement, soldiers recovered 7 long guns and 2 rocket launchers, 1 RPG and 1 blindside-type launcher, the same class of weapons CJNG used in 2015 to obliterate a military helicopter, killing 6 soldiers. El Mencho ran. He broke from the cabin with his inner circle and pushed into the woods. Special forces followed. They found him crouched in the brush, surrounded, with nowhere left to go. Gunfire erupted. El Mencho was struck. 2 of his escorts were wounded. 2 more were detained. He was airlifted toward Mexico City, alive, but he never made it. He died en route, 59 years old. The helicopter carrying him took fire from the ground. 1 round punched through the aircraft, forcing an emergency landing at a military installation in Zoila, Jalisco. No military personnel were lost in that exchange. But the fact that a dying man extraction helicopter drew live fire tells you everything about the organization still fighting for him on the ground. Somewhere in those final minutes before the soldiers reached him in the brush, El Mencho made that call, or took it, and the audio captured what that moment sounded like. The phrase everyone seized on, asterisk, they sold us, asterisk, wasn't dramatic flair. It was El Mencho's real-time assessment of what had just happened. A man who had spent decades constructing walls of loyalty through money, fear, and blood, dying with the conviction that someone inside those walls had opened a door, and based on everything that's emerged since, he wasn't entirely wrong. The surveillance net had been deliberately woven around his closest circle, the people he trusted, the people he let in, until the intelligence picture became clear enough to act on. It wasn't one informant with a phone tip. It was months of systematic monitoring converging on one moment. That distinction matters because almost immediately after the story broke, the internet decided it had a different explanation. Her name is Maria Joselin, a Mexican influencer and content creator with a significant social media following. Within hours of El Mencho's death being confirmed, her name began circulating across every platform. Viral posts claimed she was the romantic partner at the cabin. Photos spread online, allegedly placing her with El Mencho at a nightclub. The narrative practically wrote itself. The cartel boss brought down by a woman he trusted. There was one problem. None of it was true. Jocelyn denied everything, directly and publicly, describing the claims as completely fabricated and the photos as either AI-generated or digitally manipulated. Mexican authorities backed her up, confirming the operation was built on surveillance intelligence, not a tip from an individual informant. She hadn't handed anyone over. She hadn't been at any cabin. She was a civilian who got caught in the machinery of a viral rumor at the worst possible time. The threats that followed were not hypothetical. Real people sent her real messages. CJNG doesn't ask questions before it acts. The false story put her in genuine danger, and it spread faster than the correction ever could, because the correction was less interesting than the narrative. But that's not the part of the audio story that cuts deepest, because there was a second clip, an older one. Originally recorded around 2016, it had been circulating in certain corners of the internet for years, and when El Mencho died, it resurfaced everywhere, finally getting the audience it had always deserved. This recording captures a phone call. On one end, El Mencho. On the other, a local police officer during an active cartel operation. And unlike the final audio, which showed a man cornered and enraged, this one showed something far more unsettling. A man in total, effortless control. El Mencho opens by telling the officer to pull his men back, not asking, not negotiating, instructing. He tells the officer his entire squad is already located and identified, 30 men, and that he'll eliminate them down to the last one if they don't stand down. He reminds the officer in plain and direct language that the cartel is funding his department, that the paycheck the officer cashes belongs to El Mencho, and that the officer's compliance is not optional. The officer's response is immediate and complete. Yes, sir. I'll order them to fall back. You know me. I'm on your side. Not a negotiation. Not a man weighing his options. A subordinate receiving orders from a superior, except the superior was running the most violent criminal organization in Mexico, and the subordinate wore a badge. That audio doesn't just reveal corruption, it reveals architecture. In the territory CJNG controlled, the police weren't a counterforce. They were a managed asset. El Mencho didn't fight law enforcement. He absorbed it. He co-opted it. He turned the institutions designed to stop him into instruments that protected him. And the 2016 call was proof of that system working exactly as designed, which makes the contrast with the 2026 audio almost impossible to process. One call, a cartel boss commanding a cop like a regional field lieutenant. The other, the same man, a decade later, dying in the brush and cursing whoever opened the cage. The arc between those two recordings is the entire story of El Mencho's rise and fall. But what shaped the man who made those calls? That history starts much earlier and much further away. Nemesio Rubeno Ceguera Cervantes was born July 17, 1966, in Aguililla, Michoacán, a town so remote that its two defining features were avocado farms and opium poppy fields. And the boundary between them was essentially meaningless. He left school early. He worked the land. By his teenage years, he was already earning money by standing guard over marijuana crops for local operators. The economics of the place made the trajectory almost inevitable. In the 1980s, he crossed illegally into the United States and settled in California, picking up farm work in the San Francisco Bay Area. In 1986, at 20 years old, he was arrested for assault and drug possession. He served his time. When he got out, he didn't recalibrate. He escalated. He connected with a heroin trafficking ring with direct ties to Mexican suppliers and built from there. By 1994, federal prosecutors had enough to convict him of conspiracy to distribute heroin. He was sentenced to 3 years in a California prison. That prison sentence turned out to be the most consequential moment of his life, not because of what happened inside, but because of who he met. While incarcerated, El Mencho married Abigail Valencia. Her brothers were central figures in the Valencia family, known as Los Quines, one of the most powerful drug dynasties operating out of Michoacán. That marriage was a merger. It handed El Mencho financing, logistics infrastructure, and direct access to bloodline connections that would otherwise have taken decades to build. He walked into prison, a mid-level trafficker, and came out with an empire waiting for him. He was deported back to Mexico in 1997, and then, in a move that still seems almost too calculated to believe, he became a police officer. He worked as a municipal cop in Tomatlán, Jalisco. He studied from the inside, learning how law enforcement conducted operations, where the corruption chains ran, how to identify pressure points, and how to turn the system's mechanisms against itself. The knowledge he absorbed during that period became the operational blueprint for everything CJNG would eventually become. His police career ended. By the early 2000s, he was fully inside organized crime, rising rapidly through the Milenio cartel, a Michoacán-based operation allied with Sinaloa that specialized in methamphetamine production using precursor chemicals imported from Asia. He moved fast and he moved ruthlessly, building a reputation as someone whose instructions were followed the first time. Then, around 2009 and 2010, the Milenio cartel collapsed. Arrests, betrayals, structural implosion. El Mencho didn't fall with it. He pulled together the surviving remnants, combined them with his in-laws from Los Quines, and co-founded the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG. In its earliest days, CJNG wrapped itself in the language of self-defense. They marketed themselves as a militia fighting the brutality of Los Zetas, positioning their violence as righteous and protective. It bought them public sympathy, gave them room to breathe, and obscured what they were actually building. The mask came off fast. Under El Mencho's direction, CJNG didn't grow, it metastasized. They seized port infrastructure for chemical imports. They built direct supply relationships with Chinese precursor manufacturers for fentanyl production. They spread across 35 Mexican states and pushed operations internationally. Their asset base was eventually estimated somewhere between $13 and $49 billion. Analysts attributed approximately 70,000 American overdose deaths per year to the fentanyl flowing through their supply chain. And the violence was never just violence. It was communication. In 2011, CJNG left 35 bodies on a Tijuana highway with threatening banners aimed at Los Zetas, a public declaration of territorial ambition that made every newspaper in the country. In 2015, they fired a rocket launcher at a Mexican military helicopter near Otlán de Navarro, bringing it down and killing 6 soldiers, a direct military engagement that no cartel had pulled off in modern memory. They fielded armored vehicles, they mounted explosives on drones, they turned beheadings and dismemberments into instruments of psychological warfare designed to paralyze opposition before a single shot was fired. El Mencho once personally ordered the assassination of a 17-year-old YouTuber known as El Pirata de Culiacán, killed because the teenager had mocked him on social media. $15 million in US bounty money, and he still found time to eliminate a teenager for disrespect. That wasn't paranoia. That was a message to everyone watching. There is no flaw. And for years, it worked. El Mencho moved between safe houses buried in the mountains of Jalisco and Michoacán, shifting constantly, communicating through intermediaries, trusting almost no one within direct reach. The bounty kept growing, the leads kept arriving, none of them were ever quite enough, until they were what came next, nobody was ready for. Within hours of the military confirming El Mencho's death, CJNG answered, not with statements, not with negotiations, with coordinated nationwide fire. Between 80 and 252 roadblocks, narco bloqueos, appeared simultaneously across at least 20 Mexican states. Vehicles were hijacked off highways and torched in the road. Buses, trucks, and private cars went up in flames. Businesses were set alight. Supermarkets, banks, anything visible, anything accessible, anything that could burn. Major highways locked down. Schools shuttered across multiple states. Cities that had been functioning 24 hours earlier emptied out, not because of curfews, but because ordinary people understood instinctively that the streets were no longer safe. More than 70 people were killed in the aftermath. At least 25 of them were National Guard members, soldiers in open combat with cartel forces deploying rocket launchers and armored vehicles in the middle of Mexican cities. Puerto Vallarta, one of the most internationally recognizable tourist destinations in the Western Hemisphere, was engulfed in smoke. The airport at Guadalajara, which was already on the radar of every World Cup logistics coordinator in the world, descended into chaos as gunshots echoed near the terminals. Delta, American Airlines, and Air Canada pulled flights to affected regions. The US Embassy told American nationals to shelter in place. Canada issued travel warnings. A prison break at a Estapa facility near Puerto Vallarta saw 23 inmates walk out after armed men drove a van through the front entrance and killed a guard in the process. Arson attacks continued across Guadalajara for days. President Claudia Sheinbaum addressed the nation and insisted the government had the situation in hand. The people living inside that situation told a different story, and looming over every burning vehicle, every shuttered school, every panicked airport, the 2026 FIFA World Cup. Mexico is a co-host nation. The tournament opens in roughly 3 months from the date El Mencho died. Guadalajara, capital of Jalisco, El Mencho's home state and the city at the epicenter of the post-death retaliation, is a designated World Cup venue. American teams are scheduled to play in that stadium, the same stadium whose surrounding streets were on fire, while CJNG and government forces traded rocket launcher fire nearby. Delta and Air Canada weren't pulling flights over abstract security concerns. They were responding to a city that had just become a war zone, and the pressure this creates on the Mexican government, on FIFA, on US diplomatic and security structures is almost impossible to overstate. Hundreds of thousands of international tourists scheduled to arrive in a region where CJNG just demonstrated it can shut down entire states within hours of receiving bad news. That pressure didn't arrive with El Mencho's death. It arrived long before it. The Trump administration had been applying extraordinary leverage on Mexico for months. Threats of 25% tariffs, explicit statements about potential unilateral US military operations targeting cartels on Mexican soil, the USMCA trade agreement governing hundreds of billions in cross-border commerce entered formal renegotiation in January 2026, and the terms of that renegotiation were being discussed in the same breath as cartel enforcement. The message from Washington was structural and sustained: demonstrate results or face economic and political consequences that Mexico could not absorb. The carrot was equally clear: cooperation on cartels, especially ahead of a World Cup where American teams would be playing on Mexican soil and American tourists would be filling Mexican hotels, offered a path to favorable USMCA terms and a managed relationship with an administration that had shown willingness to act unilaterally. Analysts described the combination of pressure as among the most direct foreign policy leverage the United States had applied to Mexico's internal security decisions in decades. The result was the Tapalpa operation, the most significant cartel takedown in years, followed within hours by the most violent cartel retaliation in years. Whether that exchange produces lasting results depends entirely on what happens inside CJNG now. And that question has no comfortable answer. El Mencho's death removed the most recognizable name from the organization's structure. It did not remove the structure: CJNG's territorial control, its supply chains for fentanyl precursors, its political connections woven through local governments across dozens of Mexican states, its thousands of armed fighters. All of that survived February 22nd intact. The organization didn't die. It lost its architect. The succession picture is already forming, and it isn't clean. El Mencho's stepson, Juan Carlos Valencia, and his widow, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, known within the organization as La Jefa, represent the family interest in maintaining control. But cartels are not dynasties, they're armed enterprises, and armed enterprises respond to power, not bloodlines. Lieutenants across CJNG's regional structure are already performing the same calculation. The throne is empty, and the man who sat on it is gone. That calculation produces factions. Factions produce war. History offers a clear template. El Chapo's arrest and extradition didn't end Sinaloa. Sinaloa fragmented. The Chapitos and Mayos faction diverged, and the resulting internal conflict produced waves of violence that are still reverberating. Mayo Zambada himself was lured to the United States in 2024 under circumstances that remain disputed. The cartel survived both events. The kingpin strategy, applied repeatedly across the history of Mexico's drug war, has produced the same pattern every single time. The leader falls, the organization endures, and the transition period generates violence worse than what came before. For Americans living outside of any cartel territory, the ripple effect arrives in a specific and dangerous form: fentanyl, CJNG's primary export to the United States, the synthetic opioid responsible for the majority of American overdose deaths. When the supply chain disrupts, when a leadership transition creates uncertainty in logistics, distribution networks, and supplier relationships, the street-level economics inside American cities shift fast. As supply tightens and price moves, the gangs distributing fentanyl across American neighborhoods begin competing for available product. That competition doesn't stay abstract. And threading through all of it, one figure whose personal history with El Mencho never faded into professional distance. Omar Garcia Harfuch, Mexico's Secretary of Security, survived a CJNG assassination attempt in 2020 that was as close to a declaration of war as a cartel can make against a sitting government official. More than 30 gunmen ambushed his convoy in Mexico City in broad daylight, firing over 400 rounds into his vehicles. 2 bodyguards were killed. A civilian bystander died in the crossfire. Harfuch himself was shot 3 times and survived. El Mencho ordered that attack, and analysts who have watched Harfuch operate since his recovery believe the vendetta that attack created never stopped driving him. With El Mencho dead, Harfuch has what he spent years working toward. The question now is whether removing the man also removed the threat, or whether it simply activated something worse. El Mencho's final audio wasn't a confession. It wasn't a eulogy. It was a transmission from a man whose entire identity was built on the premise that the world bends to those willing to enforce their will at any cost, and who, even as that identity was being extinguished in a Jalisco forest, could not conceive of operating any other way. He addressed Wayo. He accused traitors. He issued threats. He gave orders. The machine he built received those orders, and the machine responded. 80 roadblocks, 20 states, 70 dead, a city in flames, 3 months before the world's most watched sporting event arrives on its doorstep. El Mencho's last words weren't a goodbye, they were instructions. And the men still alive, still armed, and now fighting each other over everything he left behind, are still following them.